The success of Thunderbirds after all these years is not an easy thing to explain. I think probably what happened is that, say, children who saw it when they were kids, they would have been probably 8 years old. Now, 27 years later, they're 35 or so, they've got their own children, and they probably want to see the show to revive old memories. And obviously, in doing so, they are, in a way, endorsing the program for their children. And many of the young children seeing it for the first time like the show, and it has become very, very popular. So I think it's really a mixture of nostalgia, and also the fact that the program was a very expensive, and even though I say it myself, a good program at the time. And there's nothing about it really that is dated too much. And so I think there are many reasons why it has repeated the same success that it had originally. Well, of course, now, if one is talking about the success of Thunderbirds compared to other series I made years ago, in my view, the reason is that Thunderbirds was an hour program. All the other programs were either 15 minutes or a half an hour. And in the case of Thunderbirds, because it's an hour show, it means that we can deal with the characters more, and we can go into character development. And so with a format where we are rescuing people, and it becomes very important to children watching that these people are rescued, it becomes of paramount importance that the characters who are going to be put in danger are shown to the audience at the beginning of the program, and we have time to get to know them, get to like them, before they're put in a jeopardy situation. And so the whole development of the program is much easier because it is an hour, as opposed to the half-hour programs where really there was very little time to explain anything. We had to go pretty well straight into the action. I entered the film business as a kid, and I started work in the film cutting room on feature films. I became a dubbing editor. That's the person who puts the final soundtrack together. And then around about 1958, as with a lot of other young people, I began to think that if I formed my own film company, I could do better than anybody else. And so with a few colleagues, I found a place called Islet Park, which was a mansion on the River Thames. And the attraction there was it had a small ballroom, which I thought we could use as a film stage. Upstairs there were apartments. We took one, and we set up an office, and I sat there waiting for the telephone to ring. Naively, I believed that people would ring and say, I want 4 feature films, 2 documentaries, 3 commercials, rather like ordering groceries. And of course, that didn't happen. And in the space of 6 months, we had run out of money, and we were very nearly bankrupt. And then one day, a woman by the name of Roberta Lee arrived on the doorstep, and she said, look, I have 52 15-minute scripts here for a puppet series called The Adventures of Twizzle. She was a novelist, and she had written these scripts herself. She had a very, very tiny budget, and she asked if we would be prepared to make these programs. Now, we were so short of money that if it had been 52 pictures about lion taming, I would have said yes as well. But they happened to be a program featuring puppets. And so I agreed to make the show. Now, what happened then was that, having come from the feature film world, I was really quite ashamed to tell my friends in the feature film business that I was now filming with puppets. And I'm not talking about puppets like these. I'm talking about very, very simple puppets that were on very, very thick carpet thread and operated in front of painted backings. And so I was determined that somehow I would introduce techniques which would make the puppet film respectable. And I thought, quite wrongly, that if I made them really well, the people putting up the money would say, hey, this guy can really make pictures, so why don't we give him a feature film? Instead of which, of course, the response was, hey, this guy can really make puppet films. We must give him some more puppet films to make. So the whole thing was a complete accident. When I first started making puppet films, I was quite ashamed of the fact. And if people said to me, what are you doing? I would say, I'm making horror films. I tried to keep it quiet. And so I went through this process with everybody else, of course, that was working with me at the time, trying to make the puppet film as close to a feature film as possible. And this meant three-dimensional sets. It meant puppets where the eyes moved and the eyes became very realistic. The mouth was moving in sync with the dialogue. We introduced vehicles, we introduced special effects. And one day, I remember looking at a completed film and thinking, it really isn't right to call these puppet films anymore, because in people's minds, if you say a puppet film, then here in England we had some very, very simple puppet programs for very, very young children, and I was frightened that our films would be bracketed together with this kind of program. And so I felt that it really needed a term which would separate out our pictures from the others. And so I thought, the pictures are now super. They're super pictures. They're made using marionettes, and it is a form of animation. And so I put together this ridiculous word, super marionation. I was slightly embarrassed to put it on the titles at first because I wasn't quite sure how people would react to it. And today it's almost become part of the language, but that is how the word was created. If I were to talk about the organisation at the studio and the filming of one episode of Thunderbirds, that would be extremely difficult, because we were really never making one episode at any one time. What would happen would be that we would have one script as a storyline which was being discussed with a writer. Another episode would be a script being finalized. Another episode would be in the workshops being built, not only sets and models but puppets. Another episode would actually be on the floor being filmed, and yet another in the cutting room being final cut, and finally another in the dubbing theatre with the final music and soundtrack being put down. So that at any one time there were at least 10 episodes in production in one stage or another. After I had produced my first few series with puppets, I met with Lou Grade, who is now, of course, Lord Grade. And at that time, he was the managing director of one of this country's major television companies. And he financed pretty well all the Super Marionation shows, and indeed programs like Space 1999 and UFO and The Protectors. He was a marvelous man. He was just so honest. It's difficult to explain to other people how he was so trustworthy. But I mean, to give you an example, Thunderbirds, 32 episodes would have cost, let's say, about £15 million. Now, I would meet him 7:30 in the morning. He would give me one of his Havana cigars, which he had specially made for him. They were probably about that length. And I would light one up, and he would pour a coffee from his silver coffee pot. And he would say, "Okay, Gerry, what's the next series?" And I would describe in this event, Thunderbirds. And it wasn't a very comprehensive explanation. It was simply that it would be a rescue force, it would have very advanced machines, and it would be called International Rescue. And he said, great, that sounds fantastic. You'll have lots of action, won't you? And I said, yes. He said, okay, go ahead and make it. Now, I would then drive straight back to the studio and say, okay, we're going to make Thunderbirds. He was a man whose word you could trust implicitly. You didn't have to wait for a contract. If he said, I will give you the money, then there was no question about it. The money would be forthcoming. He was also a very generous man. I remember going to meet him one morning, and I could sense that he was particularly excited, and he seemed to want to get the meeting over very quickly. And I thought that perhaps he was bored with what I was saying, but he then said, look, I'm busy, come with me, I've got something for you. And we walked together to the lift. We went down into the basement, and he said, where's your car? And I said, it's over there. And he said, have you got the keys? And I said, yes. He said, well, give me the keys. I couldn't understand this. So I gave him the keys, and he said, fine. He said, there's your new car over there. And it was a brand new Rolls Royce. And he just bought it and gave it to me like that. Again, talking in terms of English money today, we're talking about £100,000. But that's the sort of man he was. It didn't take me long to learn that if you're making a children's program, it has to be action all the way. And the things that kiddies like is jeopardy and destruction. So let's just deal with destruction. We used to make explosions in pretty well every episode. In fact, it became a hallmark of the series. And our special effects director, Derek Meddings, perfected techniques which of course today are commonplace, but at the time were state of the art. And basically how we produced these explosions was to take a relatively small amount of explosive, place it in a plastic bag together with parts of the vehicle that we were going to blow up, and then we would film the explosion with the camera turning at very, very high speed. So we would detonate the explosion, and on the studio floor, although it made a huge bang, in fact the explosion itself was very fast, like a little firework. But when the film was developed and printed, and we viewed it the next day at the correct speed, of course the whole thing was slowed down. And so we had an explosion in slow motion. And so now we would actually see the flame growing and all the pieces of debris spreading out. And some pieces of debris you could actually recognize. If it was a motor car, you could actually see perhaps a wheel spinning through the air. And by using different mixtures of explosives and sometimes adding things like rubber dust to create a lot of black smoke and orange flame, we learned to create pretty well every type of explosion we needed. But I can tell you that throughout the filming of Thunderbirds, at least 5 times every day, there was a huge bang and the place used to shake. But we were very, very careful, and fortunately we never had an accident. Having said we never had an accident, that's not quite true. On one occasion, one of our electricians, who didn't understand the technique at all, took one of these small bags of explosives and he took it out to the back of the studio, and he dug a hole and he buried it. Now, of course, the explosives now were compressed, and that's a whole new ball game. And he detonated this thinking that it would frighten the people in the studio and was going to be a huge joke, instead of which it blew in the back of the studio. Nobody was hurt, but he continued working for us for at least another 10 minutes after that explosion, and then he went. Probably the most significant invention, albeit that it wasn't registered or patented, was the introduction of what is called today television assist. In other words, a television camera looking through a film camera so that the whole crew can see what normally only the camera operator can see. And this came about because on the early puppet films, I decided that we would put the puppeteers over the top of the set, and this would enable us to build back away from camera and to get much greater depth into the shot. It meant therefore that the puppeteers were standing high up and looking literally straight down onto the puppet's head, and all they could see was the top of the head. And so when the director said, turn the puppet a little more to the right and make his or her eyes look at a certain place, the puppeteer was totally lost. And so we tried various methods, including mirrors. But one day somebody came in and he was selling industrial television cameras, which at that time were quite big. And he demonstrated one, and I suddenly said, hey, wait a minute, I've got an idea. Push the TV camera so that it's looking into the eyepiece of the cine camera. And he did that, and we, in fact, produced a very low quality, but nevertheless a picture that the camera operator only would normally see. And so we made a base plate, mounted this camera on the back of the cine camera, and that really was the birth of television assist, which is of course used worldwide today. In order that the puppeteers could operate efficiently, they were supplied with monitors where the picture was reversed, so that they were virtually looking at a mirrored image, and when they turned their puppet to the left on the screen, their puppet would also turn to the left. So I think that probably is the most significant invention. The other one was the introduction of automatic mouth movement. The early puppets had no mouths at all, and so the only way we could show which puppet was speaking was to make them nod their head when they were talking. And this irritated me enormously. And so as time went by, we made mouths for the puppets, and the mouth was operated by the puppeteer pulling a wire from overhead, and this would cause the mouth to open. But of course the mouth now stayed open, so it had to have a spring to shut it. So consequently, when the puppeteer wanted to open a mouth, she had to pull very hard on the string to overcome the return spring, and this again meant that although now the mouths were working, the puppets were still nodding their heads again. And finally, this was overcome by inventing automatic mouth movement, whereby we had an electromagnet in the head of each puppet, and we pre-recorded all of our programs, and we used to play back the sequence we were filming on the floor. And as we played back the dialogue of a particular puppet, we had a box which would translate the recorded voice into electrical impulses, which used to go up to the puppeteer's bridge, down the very fine wires, into the head, energize the magnet. That would pull up a piece of metal which would open the mouth, and as soon as the current was cut off, the mouth closed. And so at last the puppets spoke without their heads nodding. Okay, well, as most people who know Thunderbirds will recognize, this is of course Thunderbird 2. It started its life 27 years ago in the very first script that was written for Thunderbirds. And I can't remember the exact words, of course, but I remember that I described it as being a space freighter, a cargo vessel capable of carrying very, very heavy loads. And when the first film went into pre-production, Derek Meddings, who was in charge of the special effects at the time, read my words and devised this particular shape. I remember him improving the vehicle enormously, because at one time the wings were swept back, and somehow or other the aircraft didn't look different enough, so he took the wings off and put them the reverse way round, which at the time was quite novel. Of course, with today's modern aircraft, some do have wings that are swept forward. From there it went into the model department, and the entire craft was shaped from pieces of gelatine, which is a modelling wood which one can carve fairly easily. And once the initial shape was created, from that they made a mould, and from the mould they made this fiberglass shell, probably in two parts, and then connected it together, and you had the final model. Now the interesting thing is that at that point the craft is then beautifully painted, and it comes out sort of model maker's pride and joy. But the odd thing is that it then went to what we used to call the dirtying down department, and they would take this pristine model, and as you can see they would put dirty marks all over it and draw in the detailed panelling, and all of this dirtying down made the difference between the model looking like a toy and the real thing. I mean, next time you look at an airliner, you'll notice around the door where the passengers go in, you'll see that the paint there is worn by people's hands. You'll see that the cowlings on the engines are burned black from the tremendous heat. And it's all this attention to detail that makes a craft look believable when it's on the screen. Now, how do we fly Thunderbird 2? Well, of course, there were many different ways. This is a large model, and this would have been suspended on the finest wires that would support the weight, and would usually be swung on a boom so that it would fly in a very smooth arc across the set. And I think perhaps the final thing I ought to say is that if you take a motor car as an example, if you put the camera close to it, you get a close-up. If you want a long shot of a motor car, you take the camera further away. If you take the camera further away from Thunderbird 2 in the studio, you simply bring in the crew and the studio itself. And so the only way we could show Thunderbird 2 and other models in the distance was to make smaller models and smaller sets. And so there were a whole series of this craft made. This is the largest one. The smallest one was probably no more than 6 inches in length. The studio where this craft flew and where Thunderbirds was made had, taking into account all the people involved, writers and all the people who were employed outside the studio as well, total some 250 technicians. We used to shoot with 5 complete film units, shooting simultaneously every day of the week in order to turn out one picture a fortnight. We had a lot of craft, and I think it really was a joint effort. Sometimes I would describe a craft in a script, perhaps one of the writers would describe a craft, and then it would go into the special effects department, where, as I've already said, Derek Meddings played a large part in the design work. But there was also a young man called Mike Trim, who had a particular flair for hardware, and he used to design some of the craft. But of course, if you take into account the writers, the special effects department, the model makers, the dirtying down shop, and finally the director who shot the picture, all of these craft were really the product of many, many brains and a great deal of enthusiasm.